When I went to Bataan in 1941, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, I had no background or information or really any interest, except that I believed I was a part of the greatest country in the world. I was so proud of being an American that I didn't think it would be worthwhile to be anything else. I never even considered the fact. But I found myself, along with about 90,000 other men, Filipinos and Americans, in a little peninsula surrounded by Manila Bay and the China Sea, with just a 14-mile front line for the defense, and over 1 million fresh Japanese troops during a 4-month period pounded that front line and finally broke through. Along with all the others, I had known the problems of limited food supply, constant bombing, combat, and however, being young and never having suffered defeat nor read about it in our history, I didn't recognize it when it finally came. Defeat had many and varied effects on different men. Fortunately, I was approached by a then captain of the Air Force who had lived in the Philippines before the war, and he had a plan to escape from the peninsula via the very treacherous mountains in order to make contact with a Colonel Thorpe who had been commissioned by General MacArthur at the early point of January 1942, when Bataan was being established as a defense. Thorpe was given the commission to escape behind the enemy lines and form a guerrilla force with the help of the Filipino people, because they were 100% pro-American. It was a fascinating proposal and idea. It had a lot of appeal, and I never did like the idea of surrendering. I had no idea what it was like, but it packed some kind of fear as far as I was concerned, that things were beyond my control. The march was just being formed, the so-called historical Bataan Death March. The count-off at this point had not started, and so we were not identified or missed as we left the area which was occupied now by the Japanese, and we were able, like others, to escape. Unfortunately, after about 5 or 6 days, I became very ill. I didn't realize it then, but I was suffering from malaria, dengue fever, amoebic dysentery, and all of these things were coming simultaneously, and I was beginning to feel the effects. Malnutrition, of course, is a very difficult problem. I was left behind by the 6 other men. And I think perhaps the most desperate days of my entire life took place in the following 10 days, April 20, 21, 22, and so on, 1942. When by myself I tried to make my way through those very, very, very treacherous mountains. straight up, straight down. I grew up in the metropolitan area of New York, where the only up and down I ever did was on an elevator. I didn't even know how to cut grass until I was 28. Camping was something I didn't even understand. I'd never been on an outing. And you can just imagine how well equipped I was at this point to forage for myself. But this was not the problem. The problem was that those deserted battle areas were littered with the remains of the dead, the parts that the animals had not devoured, and the flies and the bugs and all of it was so desperate that it was just almost unbearable. It was most difficult for me to be able to muster enough strength to make one more step. Have you ever been in a track meet where to win you had to pack something into those last few steps that you didn't really have? It was all gone. Everything was spent. You knew you were through, but you just found something a little more. Well, fortunately, a Filipino came along, took me to an area where others had, like me, had been picked up and taken, and they nursed me back to health. I was placed in a little lean-to with a man named, Harry Porter from Lewisburg, Kentucky. And after we became acquainted, I reached into my pocket and discovered that I had there a little New Testament. Now, I was not the type or kind of person that would carry a Bible or New Testament. Not to say that I never went to church. Not to say that I had never been in Sunday school. Not to say that my family were not people who believed in God. But I didn't think it was a part of everyday life. Just Sunday, and maybe once at another time during the week for some social event. But when I proposed this escape, a red-headed lieutenant from Charleston, West Virginia, came up and placed this New Testament in my khaki shirt pocket. I readily gave it back to him and said, "I don't want it." And he insisted and disappeared. Harry Porter and I began to read through. I was not able to get up and walk, exercise. I was completely dependent, and so was he, on the fact that the Filipino people brought us rice and bananas, water, or whatever they had. We were some 10 miles north of the former frontline area, about central northern Luzon, central northern Bataan. And high jungle mountainous country. There were perhaps 300 Filipinos who had taken up temporary residency in order to evacuate the war zone. It was primitive country. It was beautiful in its growth. And now it was quiet, and it was rather colorful.